And welcome to this very special edition of the Sky News Daily Podcast. In fact, we have 5 special editions for you. We'll be taking a look back at the big stories from 2022 and how they might affect us all in 2023. We will be running the gamut from the royal family, politics, economics, the war in Ukraine. Today, though, as you might just be able to tell if you're watching us, we will be focusing on science and technology with, of course, our science and technology editor, Tom Clarke. Lovely to have you on the Daily again, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a year, hasn't it?
Indeed, yes.
And it's been quite a hot year.
That's right.
Let's start with that, shall we? Because I remember weather in the middle of the summer, and we're a distance away from it now, over 40 degrees.
A perfect place to start. That's exactly what I was reflecting on when we discussed addressing the climate issue. 19th of July, we passed 40 degrees centigrade in the UK, a temperature that people speculated we might see with climate change. It seems such a long way off when discussions like that were having, but there we saw it. I remember I was on the hunt for where the hottest place might be. We were driving around in London. I was on a rooftop in Wembley, baking in that heat, thinking about how we were going to handle the question of relating this temperature change to global averages and what that meant about the climate science, what it meant for the UK. And as I looked out across the London skyline, it was on fire. There were fires springing out across London, and I suddenly thought, this does change things. You know, it went from being that kind of slow burn climate story being taken forever to suddenly an emergency. Now, obviously, fires happen, but we saw this almost instantaneous response of the environment to that situation. And we suddenly found we were interviewing firefighters that evening about what these new temperature records might mean. You know, it was a remarkable day.
Was 2022 the year that Britain really kind of woke up to the reality of climate change?
I wonder if something changed. You know, we've been talking, I've been talking about it my entire career, and it's incremental. It's a slow burn, and we have cold years and warm years, and it's the signal behind the noise when it comes to climate change. But all of a sudden, we had this front and centre, and we really felt it. And that, I think, did make a difference. And it happened, obviously, after the war in Ukraine had begun, and we were starting to be very aware that our relationship with the fossil fuels that drive our economy is going to have to change, and that has a certain resonance to the whole climate debate. And I think it was a year. I think we'll look back on this year as a pivot point in our ambitions and our hopes to do something about the climate challenge.
I mean, it is difficult, isn't it, to indulge in kind of climate change denialism when you are living through it. But I mean, brass tacks here. Are we absolutely certain that what we saw this summer was a consequence of man's actions and not just an aberration, a one-off?
You can never say absolutely. We have heat waves. The climate is a random system driven by these events. We will have cold temperatures. We may even have future cold temperature records. And I'm sure the swivel-eyed climate denying loonies will jump from the woodwork and say, you got it wrong, as they always do. But the truth of the matter is, you look at the data, the reason we had a record in July was because the average global temperature has gone up by just over a degree in the last 50 years, 100 years. And that means every time we have a heat wave, it'll be that little bit hotter, and those records will come. You cannot ever, hand on heart, say that particular event was caused by climate change. But the pattern we're seeing in our temperatures are undeniably driven by that.
Presumably this was the year then that the world was galvanised into action, and that we got all of our world's leaders coming together and sorting this problem out, or maybe not.
No, and that's the interesting, the flip side to this story. It was a year in which we saw the much hoped for coming together of leaders to discuss the global climate problem, this time in Egypt, COP27, it's called that UN climate talks. And I think it's fair to say it was very disappointing in its broader outcomes. Some achievements were made, there were some sort of bright spots, but largely it barely built on what was agreed in Glasgow the year before, when there was some hope we were sort of getting somewhere. I think the feeling coming away from that was one of disappointment. And of course, it's largely, I think, because people's attention is focused elsewhere right now, certainly when it comes to our global leaders.
Well, let's talk then about the kind of the knock-on effects from the Ukraine war. As you say, we had 40-degree temperatures in July. We're expecting, well, I know, and from coming into the office today, that temperatures are significantly less than that now. But we are in the middle of a cost of living crisis. We are in a situation where fundamentally people cannot afford to heat their homes. Something's gone badly wrong.
It has, and if anything, illustrates the problem that we have: an over-reliance on fossil fuels, an over-reliance on poorly constructed, poorly insulated homes. It's this.
Is it an over-reliance on fossil fuels, or is it an over-reliance on fossil fuels from Russia?
I wouldn't say that. Actually, if you look at where our fossil fuels come from, by and large, we weren't that dependent on Russia at all. What I think it's illustrated is our over-reliance on a global trade in fossil fuels, which is extremely sensitive to things like conflict in one part of the world, drives up prices in Europe, drives up the price globally, and we all suffer. And I think that's been illustrated. It's been played fairly well, although not brilliantly, by Vladimir Putin, exploiting that very fact. And it's sort of thrown that into very, very sharp relief. And we are stuck. And I think it's illustrated how, despite all of our investment, and we'll come on to talk about the positives in a second, but all our investment in renewables and things like that, still 70% of our energy needs, so that is heating our homes and cooking our food and running our cars, still comes from fossil fuels. We are still hugely reliant on fossil fuels for our everyday lives.
But we are changing things, aren't we? We have had announcements on nuclear. We thought there was perhaps going to be an announcement on kind of onshore wind in England, because of course you can do it in other parts of the UK. I mean, do you get the feeling that domestically our political leaders have got an approach in mind, that they have a solution to this long term?
I think they do now. I think they can't ignore it anymore. And I think that's one of the problems we've had, particularly in Britain. We were reliant on really cheap North Sea gas for a long time. We don't have very harsh summers. We don't have very cold winters. We could basically just get away with doing nothing for too long. I think if you want to look for positives in the Ukraine crisis, and I know there are very, very, very few, one thing that you could argue, yes, it's distracted us from that noble goal of agreeing on how to cut emissions, but it probably is going to speed our action to actually doing something about it, certainly in Europe and probably in the US as well.
Where are we in terms of us being a leader in green technology? It's been a mantra for a number of politicians. How true is it?
We have talked a very good talk, and I think we have not done particularly well. That's unfair. We've done particularly well on on greening our electricity supply. So yeah, we've got a lot of offshore wind. We've done really well on that. We've actually one of the first to pass legislation to make it required to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. So we have been leaders, but we've dragged our feet in other areas, certainly in how we are reliant on gas. We've dragged our feet on how we insulate homes. But what we've seen come out of this with the government's response to the energy crisis are some significant moves. We are now seriously putting our weight behind nuclear power, which is something that's been long overdue. Unless you're ideologically opposed to nuclear, it's a very, very good solution to the energy crisis we find ourselves in. We are now talking seriously about addressing the really important issue for fuel poverty, but also for the climate, of making our homes better suited to cleaner forms of energy and insulating our homes and making them warmer and cheaper and healthier for people to live in.
If you've watched a minute of Sky News over the past 12 months, you will undoubtedly have seen at some point the demonstrations that have been taking place. A variety of groups, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain. To what extent do you think that their direct action has had an effect on the policy making?
Do you know what? I've been mulling this over, because if I was sitting in my car on the M25 trying to get across the Dartford Bridge, I don't think I'd have quite the same sympathy for their cause.
I don't know if we've got the bleep button standing by to the extent that it would be required if I had been driving.
And of course, I feel for anybody who's in that situation, and you think about some of the emergencies and small life crises that must have been impacted by that. But if you also step back and you think really dispassionately about the threats that climate poses to us, and also the threat that things like our over-reliance on fossil fuels means for people's lives in the UK, we are in a bit of an emergency here. We've been saying it for a long time, and I can also really sympathise for those who have had enough and they want to see action.
Well, let's see what happens in 2023. For now, though, let's turn our attention to big tech. And I suppose it's probably slightly smaller tech than it was this time last year.
It's astonishing. If you think about it, these were the companies who, for a decade or more, had just been on the up and up and up and are growing and growing and growing. And a headline caught my eye the other day. This was after the Q3 results came out for the 5 big companies, big tech. I'm just trying to remember who they are. Apple, Alphabet, the parent company of Google, Microsoft, Amazon. Their collective value shrank by $3.7 trillion.
Sorry, yeah,
over this
I
year.
can't
It's
even
mind-boggling.
conceive of that number.
It's larger than the GDP of sort of small countries. A huge amount of value wiped off their stock. We saw a big slide in big tech.
Why?
Right. With all these things, it's multiple reasons. But the pandemic had a lot to do with it. A lot of them expanded on the back of us being shut at home, buying more stuff on Amazon, for example. So that's delivery drivers, and we were making more journeys, and there was lots of growth there. Ad revenues fell because of the global economic crisis. Most of these companies, certainly the social media ones, are very reliant on advertising to make their profits. And we also saw people no longer working from home, and we were very reliant on their goods and services while we were working at home. Some of those factors contributed to it, as well as the sort of general economic outlook, and they shrank significantly. So it's a sort of business story about the conglomerates and the way they shrink, and these things come and go. But there was something more interesting in the big tech slide as well, and it's not like the bubble has burst, but some people in Silicon Valley I've been speaking to are saying the hype bubble you could almost hear that popping.
God, you're going to have to explain that to me.
I'll give you a very good example. Remember Facebook?
Yes, I do, yes.
They rebranded last year. We were all busy with the pandemic, but they rebranded themselves to Meta. Now, you could argue cynically it was partly to try and quickly change their image, given a lot of bad press around some of the things that have been going on, revealed by whistleblowers, etc. But it was also because Mark Zuckerberg, who leads the company formerly called Facebook, now Meta, he wanted to illustrate his vision, where he thought the world of big tech was going, and it was going into the metaverse. We could leave the universe we currently live in, and we could meet each other in this virtual world, and they had a vision for how they were going to do it. And what we saw a year later was no one's particularly impressed with the universe they created for us.
Have you tried it?
I have.
What's it like?
I've been inside. Now the technology, when you put a virtual reality headset on, there is some magic there. And I think we should say this from the outset. The metaverse probably is going to be a wonderful thing at some point in the future. It's just not happening as quickly as I think some of these companies wanted us to believe and expected their investors also to believe.
We cannot talk about big tech without mentioning the biggest tech story, and it's probably of the latter half of this year. After a somewhat protracted process, Elon Musk, he of Tesla, he of SpaceX, reached down the back of the sofa, found 44 billion, and decided to buy Twitter. How's that going?
Not well, is it? And I think this also speaks to that sort of hype bubble a little bit more. Elon Musk is there is no doubt he is a visionary. He has driven a vision. He has driven companies to succeed in incredible ways. But the way he's communicated and handled the takeover of Twitter, I think that the mask has slipped a little bit, and we're getting a little insight into some of the vanity and the let's face it, rather odd values and aspirations of some of these titans of big technology, and that sort of undermined a lot of people's confidence. And I'm not just speaking from my sort of own sort of maybe arguably left-leaning journalistic sort of view. These are big investors on Wall Street and people like that aren't liking what they see, and they're nervous about it.
But who would have thought that a kind of a tech billionaire might be just a little bit weird? I mean, just in terms of my own experience on Twitter, I didn't really notice much of a change. But recently, certainly the number of spam accounts that appear to be cropping up, that has increased. The level of the invective that is directed at certain people, that appears to have increased. I mean, look, Twitter was not known as a cash cow, was it? It was not a massively profitable organisation for most of its existence. So why did he go for it?
The best analysis I've had is because he loved it, and when he sets his mind to something and somebody challenges him, he will not be beaten, so he'll go ahead. But he set himself a very difficult task of making it profitable. Maybe it was never going to work as a profit-making app. And in the current climate, with other platforms like Instagram and the other social media apps, they're not performing particularly well either because of ad revenues. Even the giant that is TikTok globally is having its own struggles of remaining profitable. So it's a difficult space to be in. And a lot of people are looking at Elon Musk and saying, you're a visionary for driving engineers to solve big problems, but social media really might not be your natural habitat.
And as a broader point, there is still this as yet unresolved tension between, on the one hand, people like Elon Musk who describe themselves as kind of freedom of speech absolutists, and the fact that in every country that they work in, there is a jurisdiction, there is a legal process that they have to follow. And indeed, it's something we're talking about very openly in this country at the moment.
Absolutely. You're seeing, There are some people speculating that Twitter may not even be able to continue to operate in the EU under rules. Will they be able to operate under our online safety bill, which I want to say a bit more on in a moment? And there are suggestions that TikTok, because of the relationship with the US and China, may be blocked in that country. Next year is going to be a very, very interesting one to see how social media platforms continue to operate as society catches up with just how harmful they are. I think one of the things that I'm most looking forward to in the year to come will be our online safety bill here in the UK. It's a very complex piece of legislation. It's going to be hard fought over. But I think anybody, but particularly a parent, and I have young children, seeing their interaction with social media, something has to change. We cannot continue as a society with the relationship that young people currently have with social media apps. It's something really got to give there.
It's a very dangerous world out there. Tom, you draw breath for a second. Still to come, though, we will be discussing exactly where we are at with COVID and how medical science can continue to improve our lives in 2023 and beyond. Stay where you are. Welcome back. We did promise you on the daily that we would be looking positively into 2023. We'll do that in a minute. Tom Clarke, our Science and Technology editor, is still here. Tom, we cannot review the year, in fact, review the past 3 years, let's say, without mentioning COVID. And I suppose the thing that for many people has been pretty pleasing is that, yeah, we're back in winter. Lots of people are having, the respiratory infections and so on and so forth. But in terms of COVID, it hasn't come back and made the impact that some quite felt it would.
Yeah, I think if you asked me this question this time last year, I would have told you we still have a long way to run. We have no idea how this is going to pan out. We had new variants emerging. We didn't know how much of a threat they were going to pose to people. We had a pretty awful winter peak, if you recall, and then on into the early months of last year as well. But what we've seen as the vaccines have been rolled out, and dare I say it, as more of us have been infected, possibly on top of having had those vaccines, that the impact subsequent waves have been having has been much milder and it's been shorter lived. We do have a winter coming up. I'd hate to sort of be too optimistic, but I think we can certainly be far more optimistic, having seen a couple of recent autumn waves of COVID come around, about this winter in terms of COVID transmission and illness in the hospital than we could have been before.
Is that because of the vaccines? Because I would have thought by now. I mean, I'm lucky.
100%.
Really?
Yeah.
Good.
I think the vaccines have proven their worth and then some. They are not perfect. Very, very few vaccines are. They do not stop the virus being transmitted around. But what we've seen is the levels of hospitalisation, the severity of disease that people are having has just got less and less and less and less. That has been a huge benefit of those vaccines. And possibly, arguably, the fact they're not perfect, the fact they're still allowing the virus to transmit a little bit, might be helping, although for those people who are vulnerable, this is obviously not a good thing at all, but for the population at large, allowing the virus to move around a little bit and continue to infect us, as happened to my family a couple of weeks ago, that is further sort of boosting our immunity as we go forward. And when it comes to new and emerging diseases, I think there's already evidence the problem's only getting worse in terms of threats, and we need to go beyond the lessons that we learned from COVID.
I mean, you've got monkeypox, Mpox, as we're now supposed to call it. My last trip to Scotland, the number of dead guillemots I saw on the beach alerts me to the fact, avian flu is still an issue. There is some stuff out there we need to keep eyes on.
Yeah, we have a disease like Ebola, which is exquisitely deadly compared to COVID, that used to cause very occasional, intense but very small outbreaks. We've had increasing numbers of quite deadly Ebola outbreaks, which thankfully the most recent one does seem to be coming under control, but constant reminders of the way, with 7 billion people on the planet, the need to feed them all with agricultural methods that push intensification. Bird flu is a worrying example of a virus which in recent years actually looks like it's less of a threat to humans. It is very closely related to human flu viruses. It wouldn't take very much for it to become a concern for human transmission. We certainly saw that with something like COVID. We cannot carry on doing things the way we're doing when it comes to agriculture, the way we move food around the planet, the way we expect to buy cheap food. I mean, there are lots of concerns around that interface between our biodiversity and diseases, and that should be very, very high on the agenda at the moment, I think.
Well, Tom, as you know, I am a man of my words, and we did promise our listeners some reasons to be cheerful, and we got 2 of them this year. Well, we got quite a lot of them this year, but we got 2 in particular on malaria And on a topic that you and I discussed not long ago, Alzheimer's.
That's right. I mean, starting with Alzheimer's, a major breakthrough. And I don't like using that word when it comes to science and technology, because that's not really how science works. It's a slog, not some great eureka moment after eureka moment. But we had one recently with the discovery of the first drug that slows the progression of Alzheimer's disease. It was modest in its effects. It very much a first go, but it proves that science is on the right track. And I think it's going to really open up the field of Alzheimer's research to more money, more drug development. And I think for the millions of families out there living with Alzheimer's, living with someone with Alzheimer's, it's a real cause for hope. On malaria, we were talking, there was a lot of bad news in terms of diseases, but again, a vaccine that was trialled this year showed 80% efficacy at reducing the effects of malaria. That's a potentially huge development. If that
huge number of lives saved.
650,000 kids a year die of malaria, is estimated. So the impact of that vaccine could be enormous for those societies and for those families. So it's hard to overestimate the impact of a good malaria vaccine. And just two more picks I want to throw in there. We gave big tech an awfully hard time in this podcast, I think. And I think they brought it upon themselves. But look at what artificial intelligence is doing. Yes, it does threaten to take over the world and drive us all out of work, and there's a dystopian future for artificial intelligence. But we saw a significant breakthrough this year in using AI to understand disease. And I think applying computing power to human biology is going to be a big story in the coming year or two. We'll see a lot of discoveries there. And there couldn't be a bigger threat than global annihilation. We could be wiped out by a comet at any minute. But the other great breakthrough this year, NASA, their DART mission proved we can nudge asteroids off course and potentially save life on Earth. And I think that what more to be cheerful about there is than that?
Brilliant stuff, although I will say at this juncture, you find me the artificial intelligence that can host the Sky News Daily and I'll give you 20 quid. Tom Clarke, many thanks indeed. Thanks for joining us on this special edition of The Daily. We, of course, have covered in greater depth a lot of the topics that Tom and I have been discussing on this episode, on other episodes of the Sky News Daily. Just do a search for those words right there. We'll see you again.